The Dark Knight burst its way into theaters in the summer of 2008, although it almost seems like yesterday. I remember standing in a long line for the midnight show. The anticipation in the air was palpable. Everyone was excited. A lot of this energy came from the untimely and tragic death of Heath Ledger, whose iconic performance would go down as one of the great screen acts of all time. Ledger's death hung like a mist over the film. You couldn't really talk about The Dark Knight back then without referring to it in some way, and it bore resemblance to a character arc one might find in a movie. Ledger's casting was initially met with a lot of derision. That guy from 10 Things I Hate About You playing one of the most dastardly and evil villains in all of fiction, it just didn't click for a lot of people. That is until behind-the-scenes pics and rumors of Ledger doing an off-kilter, totally fresh take on the Joker started to leak to the public. And when the trailer hit, almost all criticisms of the casting were silenced. Ledger had won people over, but then came his tragic death as a result of an overdose on various medications. But a now infamous conspiracy theory held that Ledger had died as the result of going too far down the rabbit hole of the Joker performance, that the performance had an extreme psychological effect on him, causing him to overindulge in medication to control these bouts of psychosis. This was, of course, proven false by the fact that Ledger was often playful and jovial when the cameras weren't rolling. Going from an unwanted joke in casting to brilliant performer to untimely death was a major arc, and more than likely had a major impact on The Dark Knight's massive box office take, and its reputation as one of the best comic book movies ever made. But controversy of another sort became prevalent after the film's release. This was an outcry from a certain corner of the fandom community that the movie was riddled with glaring plot holes that made the film virtually nonsensical. This was a surprise to me when I read about these plot holes, because watching the film that late night in the summer of 2008, I was completely unaware of them. Maybe it was being intoxicated with excitement for the film and being swept up in the grandeur of the cinematic experience that allowed me to remain ignorant of these holes. I'm usually pretty good at spotting glaring plot holes in movies, but this time I'd been caught off guard. Even after viewing the film several times, I had not really become aware of these inconsistencies until I read the online articles and message board posts that detailed these holes. Why had I missed them? But what is a plot hole, and why are they so important? A movie's plot is nothing more than a sequential block of individual scenes strung together one after another. These scenes are almost always leaving out large chunks of time, choosing instead to skip the portions that add nothing to the dramatic needs of the story. For instance, when you wake up in the morning, you do a number of things before starting your day. Yawning, sitting up, using the bathroom, organizing the day's outfit, taking a shower, brushing your teeth, etc., etc. Unless these events are relevant to the dramatic needs of a story, there is no reason to show them. As the old saying goes, movies are life with all the boring parts cut out. There is another phenomenon called suspension of disbelief that allows the audience to ignore these missing sequences and fill in the gaps, so to speak, giving the film the benefit of the doubt that the filmmakers are not necessarily ignoring these sequences, they're just choosing not to show them. For instance, if a character had a morning routine like the one I just mentioned, but it was not filmed, the audience still knows they likely did these things before whatever scene they're watching, and the character didn't just materialize out of thin air. This agreement with the audience allows filmmakers to only include scenes that are relevant to the dramatic needs of the story that they're telling, and what you leave out becomes just as important as what you leave in. A plot hole is a different thing altogether. It relates more to logic. It is a filmmaker leaving out certain information in order to include something that works on a dramatic level, but challenges the logic of the proceedings. For instance, one of the supposed plot holes in The Dark Knight is during the courtroom scene in which Harvey Dent is grilling a mob witness as to the identity of the new boss of the Falcone crime family. The witness pulls a gun on Dent, who skillfully disarms him. Now, the major question is, how did this man get a gun into a courtroom? Courtrooms are heavily monitored, and metal detectors at the entrances prevent anyone from bringing firearms into the building. So how exactly did this gun get inside the courtroom? If you believe it's a plot hole, then the gun is there because it needed to be. It was written in by the writers for dramatic purposes. regardless of the implausibility of the event. But that doesn't mean it isn't possible. Of course, someone could have given it to the man inside the building, perhaps a corrupt police officer, as there are always cops in a court building. But this also becomes part of the problem, because if that were the case, why not show it? This would immediately cover the plot hole with a logical event. But the filmmakers didn't do this. Why didn't they do it? Why would they leave out such crucial information that could easily explain an event which would probably become more of a distraction for the audience and not allow them to enjoy the story? Remember, suspension of disbelief is a pact between the filmmaker and audience. It allows the audience to trust that the filmmaker knows what they're doing and that they're in good hands, which allows them to relax and just enjoy the film. When you start creating sequences that require implausibility to work, then that pact with the audience becomes at best shaky and at worst broken entirely. But when I saw the film, this didn't enter my mind. It was a well-written scene with a clever dramatic twist. Harvey Dent, a mere lawyer, was able to skillfully disarm a crime figure, simultaneously becoming a hero and planting the seeds of his eventual fall from grace, as his aggressive actions and arrogance were part of a dark side that would eventually consume him and cause his transformation into Two-Face. It's a brilliant scene, but in order to create this, a gun had to be used. And a gun from a witness in a courtroom makes no sense, not from a logic point of view. Logic in movies is a funny thing. It's amazing how far an audience will go in ignoring logic for the sake of a good time. How logical is your average action movie, with its pretzel logic physics, nonsensical character motivations, deus ex machinas galore, and often a complete disregard for anything resembling a coherent storyline? But one has to remember that movies work or not based on expectations, and whether those expectations are met. A silly action movie is not expected to make sense, but an intimate character drama is. You can't punish a filmmaker for making exactly the movie they set out to make. While you may or may not like the film, you can't expect logic in a genre that routinely creates scenarios that defy logic entirely. The Dark Knight is interesting because it rides the knife edge of audience expectation. While it has large, thrilling action sequences, it also has small, intimate character moments. It kind of defies genre. It's an action-packed comic book movie with silly villains, but also a deep philosophical crime drama. And the Batman himself is about as silly as it gets. A man dressing up as a giant bat would be comical if it weren't handled with such seriousness. But there are some things that are borderline inexcusable, like the scene where the Joker escapes the opening bank heist in a school bus that falls perfectly in sync with a row of other school buses that happen to be going by at the exact moment he needs them to, and with spacing just large enough for his bus to fit. How could this possibly have happened? Of course, anything is possible, but the likelihood of this working out exactly the way the Joker needed it to is remote in the extreme. But again, while watching the film, I was mostly unaware of this. The bus thing just made sense because I was along for the ride at that point. My suspension of disbelief had not been broken. Christopher Nolan seems to have mastered the art of keeping an audience's trust while creating sequences with certain logic issues. But maybe suspension of disbelief works for other reasons. Cinema is in fact a dream medium. We sit down, focus on a screen for a certain length of time, and allow the experience to wash over us, often without judgment. Like a dream, it unfolds in a sequence that keeps us mystified, and when it's over, we often can barely remember exactly what happened. But the impression is perhaps more important than the details. Maybe the plot holes in The Dark Knight don't matter, because the impression the film imparts upon the audience is so strong, and maybe picking at these supposed holes is nothing more than an academic exercise that has little to no effect on the actual film, or the experience. Most films have some sort of logical inconsistency if you look hard enough. The fact that some films have more glaring holes than others is perhaps beside the point. Maybe it is the effect the dreamlike illusion has on the audience that is more important. Maybe character, theme, and plot have more priority than logical consistency. If you enjoyed this video, consider hitting the like and subscribe button, as I'll be posting more content in the future. Thanks for watching.